visual rami. This is going to be the sciatic nerve going out. But here's our pudendal nerve coming out the greater sciatic notch, going over the ischial spine, coming back in the lesser sciatic notch, and traveling to the penis and bulbospongiosis and ischial cavernosus muscles. Okay? So if it helps, you can print this off in black and white and color that a different color to make it stand out from everything else, because we don't learn everything that's on this diagram, thankfully. Or you don't have to anyway. Now, do you remember the source of parasympathetic fibers that are going to be in this region? Obviously vagus and ocular motor and glossopharyngeal are parasympathetic fibers coming from the brainstem. But parasympathetic is a cranial, what? Cranial, what's the other part? Sympathetic, some come from the brainstem, the rest of the parasympathetic fibers come from the?
Sternal.
No. So we have the four cranial nerves, ocular motor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus, that are brainstem, and that gives rise to the term cranial. Sympathetic is called thoracolumbar. Parasympathetic is cranial sacral. So the sacral portion of the spinal cord. Remember, it seemed really weird that we have this big gap in the middle where we had no parasympathetic fibers? Okay, so let me kind of diagram that on the board. For those of you that didn't go into it last semester. Those of you that did and forgot. Remember, our autonomic nervous system is involuntary. It's the general visceral efferent. So it's the motor going to smooth muscle and cardiac muscle and glands. Right? We have two aspects to it. We have parasympathetic, which is typically generalized as the rest and digest. So it decreases heart rate and increases smooth muscle and glandular activity of the digestive system. So it increases peristalsis of the muscles moving the food through your digestive tract. It causes the pancreas to release insulin after you've absorbed glucose. It also causes the bladder to contract. So when we do a urinary system, it's going to cause the smooth muscle of the bladder to contract and the sphincter of the bladder to relax to allow urine to pass through. It also causes the peristalsis of the urethra as the urine is moved through. Okay? Sympathetic is often in opposition to that. So sympathetic is the fight or flight system. Heart rate goes up. We want the blood flow going out to the skeletal muscles, not to the body viscera. So peristalsis, movement of the digestive organs, decreases. Going to the bathroom is inhibited. So the bladder muscle relaxes and the sphincter contracts. Okay, so this is often described as dual innervation. Organs have one or the other, and they work in opposite components. Some structures get only one or the other, and primarily it's sympathetic. So sympathetic nerves will follow our peripheral nerves out to the skeletal muscles and out to the skin. And so in the skeletal muscles, they'll cause constriction or dilation of blood vessels in the skeletal muscles. In the skin, it'll cause constriction or dilation. So typically what we get is dilation in skeletal, constriction in skin. So when you get scared, you go pale because we're decreasing the blood flow to the skin and increasing the blood flow to the skeletal muscle so you can fight or run. And we decrease the blood flow to the viscera. So we're not trying to digest stuff while you're using that oxygen to fight or flight. Okay? So in almost every area, it's sympathetic, increases or decreases, not a dual innervation of blood vessel constriction and sweat gland activation. Because only the sympathetic goes out to the periphery. Right? Now, in anatomical organization, we have the brainstem. On the spinal cord. And so we have preganglionic fibers from the brainstem that are parasympathetic, and postganglionic fibers going to the actual organ to be innervated. So this is the ocular motor nerve, facial, and glossopharyngeal. We have our parasympathetic, whoops, wrong one. We have our parasympathetic ganglia, the ciliary ganglia, and the sphenopalatine ganglia, and the otic ganglia. Ganglia, remember, are collections of cell bodies outside the central nervous system. These are not questions I'm going to test you on for this unit. I'm just kind of reviewing here. Vagus nerve is the longest of our cranial nerves that is parasympathetic. It's going to go to the heart or the lungs, the pancreas, the small intestine, to the transverse colon. That's about where it ends. Okay? And then within the wall of that organ, we have a very short postganglionic neuron. So once we're in the descending colon, or in the rectum, or in the bladder, or in the vagina, or the uterus, or in the seminal vesicles, or the penis and the clitoris, vagus doesn't function, okay? Because it doesn't, it doesn't go that far. Vagus means wanderer, but it doesn't wander that far off the reservation. So that's our cranial component. Now, the rest of the parasympathetic system is sacral. We have this big gap in the middle. And coming out of the spinal cord with the ventral rami of our peripheral nerve. If you don't understand ventral rami, go back to the nervous system on the spinal cord and look that up. So coming out of the spinal cord with the peripheral nerve, we have ventral rami. We don't talk about ventral and dorsal rami with cranial nerves, so that's why we put it up there. Now, most of the ventral rami, so here is a ventral ramus coming out of the spinal cord. Most of them are going to form the sacral plexus, the sciatic nerve, and other structures. Okay? So they're carrying motor neurons to the skeletal muscles of your lower extremity or your buttocks, and sensory neurons back from those regions as well. But before they get there, they're also carrying the motor neurons of parasympathetic cells, and those come off of the ventral rami. You can see that right here. So here are ventral rami, anterior ramus means the same thing, and coming out of that, not going into the sciatic nerve or the pudendal nerve, are the preganglionic fibers that are parasympathetic. So these are going to come out and go into the pelvis. These are preganglionic parasympathetic. They go into a mishmash of nerves, pass through that, and then let's say we're talking about, our example last semester was the bladder, and there we would have our postganglionic neuron. Okay. So this would be the equivalent of what we call the vagus nerve, except it's coming off the sacral spinal cord. And what did we call these preganglionic fibers that we see here? The general term is splanchnic, but parasympathetic splanchnic were pelvic splanchnic nerves. So each of these groups of fibers coming off of each of these ventral rami is identified as a pelvic splanchnic nerve. We don't get any more specific than that, so they don't have individual names. Okay? Remember how I said we have sacral splanchnic and pelvic splanchnic? And do you remember the difference between which were sympathetic and parasympathetic? Pelvic splanchnics, PS, are parasympathetic. Okay. What's the neurotransmitter released by these? Acetylcholine. So both synapses In the ganglion and in the organ, these are going to be releasing acetylcholine. That's our parasympathetic neurotransmitter. Okay. So for erection, if we follow this through, here's pelvic splanchnic coming through our plexus, the inferior hypogastric plexus, and entering into the nerve, the penis. Okay. At this point, it's called the cavernous nerve. So we're going to have pelvic splanchnic. I'll draw it facing the same direction. So coming off of our ventral rami, parasympathetic, we're going to have pelvic splanchnic up here. It's called pelvic splanchnic. As it gets to the penis, it's known as the cavernous nerves. And that makes sense because they're going into the corpora cavernosa. They're going to the erectile tissue. So they go to the smooth muscle of penile arterioles and release their neurotransmitter to the smooth muscle of those penile arterioles. Now typically the neurotransmitter of parasympathetic is acetylcholine. Okay? But in this case, and this is not a diagram you have to memorize, okay? It's just kind of showing what's happening cellularly. In this case, it can happen both ways. So acetylcholine is released. The epithelial cells lining the blood vessel wall release nitric oxide, or the cavernous nerve itself can release nitric oxide. All right. So both neurotransmitters can occur. So either at this point we have either acetylcholine, which results in the release of nitric oxide, or we have nitric oxide itself. And it's the nitric oxide that actually functions through cyclic GMP, but I'm not going to test you on that part of it, and causes calcium channels to be opened. Okay. Or calcium channels to be closed. In this case, it's inhibiting calcium channels. How do we know that? Actually, it's changing potassium too. This results in smooth muscle relaxation. So the reason the smooth muscles of the penile arterioles relax is because of parasympathetic innervation. So erection is a parasympathetic event. It's autonomic. So the reflex is going to be caused by sensory stimuli. I want a green one. So sensory neurons from the glans penis are going to go to the spinal cord. What nerve are they going to travel in?
What do you mean?
What is the name of the peripheral nerve that would contain these? What nerve would we cut, and then the guy's glans penis would be numb? So what's the sensory? Let me go back to this previous picture. So to stimulate this reflex, because this is a visceral reflex. Actually, this is the best one here. So to stimulate erection, it can obviously happen, and most oftentimes does, from psychological, looking at pictures and all that kind of thing. But certainly, sensory direct stimulation to the glans penis is going to stimulate sensory neurons, all right, that are going to carry that sensory stimulation back to the spinal cord. Pudendal nerve. Okay. So in erection, the reflex is sensory stimuli through the pudendal nerve to the spinal cord. Remember, reflex is typically sensory to motor. So if I have a knee-jerk reflex, I tap my patellar quadriceps tendon. That stretches that muscle, and that sensory information is taken to my spinal cord via the femoral nerve. And then in the spinal cord, that's it's connected to the motor neurons to my muscle. That goes back out the femoral nerve, and I kick out. Okay, that's a voluntary reflex. Autonomic reflexes, they don't travel in the same nerve structure. So sensory reflex is coming up the dorsal nerve of the penis, which is going to be part of the pudendal nerve, and gets into the spinal cord, and then it's going to form an arc with the autonomic motor coming back out the preganglionic pelvic splanchnic nerves here that form the cavernous nerves, and the motor response is dilation of the arteriole. Okay? So let me erase this and write that. It's written out in your lecture notes, but let me just write that sequence out here. Because all the other reflexes follow the same pathway. So sensory response, sensory stimuli are carried by dorsal nerve of the penis, which becomes part of the pudendal nerve. That carries it to the spinal cord. All right, so it's going to come in the dorsal roots of the spinal cord. The spinal nerve. And then it's going to form an arc with the preganglionic parasympathetic cells that are our pelvic splanchnic nerves. Those are motor, so they're going to go out the ventral root. Which we eventually call the cavernous nerves when they end up going to the penis and not the bladder. And then within the penis, this binds to smooth muscle cells. And we have the effect of nitric oxide. So our sensory arm is so touching the glans penis, or the glans penis being in the vagina or whatever, traveling from dorsal nerve to pudendal nerve. It's really the same sensory neuron, just as it comes together with other neurons, the name changes. It's like you're on one road and another roads come into it, they change the name, but you never got on to a different road. Okay? So dorsal nerve of penis becomes the pudendal nerve, goes into the spinal cord, arcs with the motor, which is parasympathetic, that goes out the ventral root as the preganglionic cell forming our pelvic splanchnic. When that neuron, those neurons end up in the penis, it's called the cavernous nerve, but it's still the same neuron, releasing nitric oxide on the muscle itself. Now, if the stimuli is visual, you're watching an erotic movie or reading a erotic romance novel or whatever, okay? Because the same pathway works for women in erection of the clitoris. Then you're going to have activation of this neuron by descending neurons from the brain. Now, what happens if we cut the spinal cord? Let's say we cut the spinal cord, say close is S23, 4, if we cut the sacrospinal cord at T10, can this individual still have an erection?
Yes.
Would they be able to feel stimulation of the glans penis? No. They don't need to, because this is a reflex. That sensory information is still getting to the spinal cord, still connecting with the parasympathetic neurons and sending the motor impulse back to the penis. So for many neurologically damaged individuals with spinal cord damage, they can still have an erection and can still produce kids. Okay, they can still have intercourse. They're not going to feel it, but just knowing that that's a possibility can help them feel that they haven't lost all of their manhood, and that those components can still work. All right. So that is kind of pathway is similar to what we see with emission and with ejaculation. However, emission, remember, is movement of the sperm through the vas deferens and secretion of the glands to the urethra. This pathway is the same, well, sort of. The sensory part is the same, but instead of parasympathetic, it's going to be sympathetic. All right, so erection is parasympathetic. Emission is sympathetic. Now you will find some articles that say the glands are activated by parasympathetic because there can be dual innervation, but the primary stimulus to sperm movement and to seminal vesicle secretion is sympathetic, meaning it's coming from our sympathetic chain. Right? And these are known as sacral splanchnic. Okay? Yes, sacral starts with an S, sympathetic starts with an S, so sacral splanchnic are sympathetic. Pelvic splanchnic are parasympathetic. All right. Ejaculation. Again, we'll review this a little bit after you've had time to, if I talk too longer, you're not going to get any of it. So ejaculation is peristaltic movement of the muscles, contraction of the muscles of the urethra, milking the sperm through, because remember they don't swim out, and contraction of our ischocavernosus and bulbospongiosus muscles. That is parasympathetic and voluntary motor. Why do we include voluntary motor? Bulbospongiosus and ischocavernosus muscles are voluntary muscles. So parasympathetic, pelvic splanchnic again, this time to the urethral muscles to move the sperm, pudendal nerve to ischocavernosus and bulbospongiosus. Okay? So I'll take a little bit of time to diagram that part with you tomorrow. Right now I think I would be wasting my time. So let's take a break and we'll have the quiz at 10:30. Okay?
And the quiz is on next